Good afternoon, I'm Doug. I wrote the Guardsman series under the pen name of R.G. Taark. We have the Guardsman number 3. This is Wrath and Retributions right here on the wall. Today we are on episode number 40, almost through. We are on chapters 93 and 94. As always, please sit back, relax, and enjoy. When you get a chance, please hit that like, comment, and subscribe button. Love to hear from you. If you're really interested, the book should be down in the description if you want to check it out. Again, please sit back, relax, and enjoy.
The Guardsman, Book 3, Wrath and Retribution, Episode 40, Chapters 93 through 94. Chapter 93. Bryce wandered into the investigator's office in his civilian clothing, with a stack of hard-copy paper files in a few random and sloppy folders, looking every bit the confused mid-level flunky sent out on an errand. He just happened to visit Mario's office in those civilian clothes under the pretense of looking for an arson investigation. Inside of his left overcoat pocket, he had already hidden a strip of magnetic tape peeled and sliced to the correct length. He ran through the pricing and service terms with one of Temposo Investigation's people, the only one in the office. The meeting went well, if tepidly. He was after all playing a flunky sent out to get a best deal, so he figured he could not be too excited about anything the guy said. He received a stack of informational garbage and an old-fashioned pretty picture flyer, shuffled the papers to his left hand as he stood and shuffled back and forth to the door. He slowed at the office threshold, and the hard-selling investigator lurched to catch up and shake his hand. He emphatically wished Bryce well in his search, and informed him again that he'd be there all day to answer any questions he might have. Bryce shuffled hands clumsily as he grasped the investigator's right hand with his own. He knocked the files apart with an apparently clumsy move. The falling folder spilled raw imagery of a random pre-investigation fire along with preliminary corporate security notes. He grumbled, "Damn it," as his left fingers clung to the last empty folder in his left hand. The overly helpful detective bent, head down to scoop and help him organize the fallen material. The investigator helpfully chatted about what he could do to address some of the issues he was seeing on the images. He was obviously working hard to impress a layman with his investigative knowledge. Bryce swapped the folder to his right hand. He deftly pulled the tape from the inside of his pocket and plastered it to the lock. He surreptitiously placed it over the electromagnetic locking mechanism. It was a stupidly simple trick, but it would trick the cheap lock into thinking that the field was engaged and still in place when he returned and pried the door open later that night. He bent his knee, laying the folder in hand open to scoop up some of the imagery. While shuffling, the investigator commented helpfully on how Bryce should have just brought it saved in his comm so they could review the imagery in detail on a terminal. While he jammed things into the folders, Bryce hemmed and hawed about, "Stupid boss, not wanting digital images floating around in detective offices we were not going to hire." Unsure if it was a slight or just a weird boss, the investigator politely agreed that keeping security and client confidentiality was of utmost importance at Temposo Investigations. Bryce thanked him again when they'd reassembled his fictitious arson file, and he was out the door. Since he was out and about on assignment, Bryce decided to relax a little before the evening's fun. He went to see a vid where he disposed of the false case folders in a trash bin after the show. Relaxed and still with hours to kill, he had a nice leisurely dinner with no shift change rush between himself and Major McKinley. He even wandered around a concourse a few levels up from Temposo Investigations, shopping for nothing in particular. He stayed until shift change when he decided to ride the trams around randomly in rush hour traffic as he watched for tails and people too interested in his movements. He went in and out of a dozen buildings on different levels at every entry and exit. Bryce deliberately entered low on the building that housed Mario's office. Like a typical building lower level, It was unmonitored and unsecured, both of which served his purpose before breaking into a commercial office. Instead, he rounded a corner from the almost vacant tram stop, and he got mugged by 3 gutter rats. He groaned at the bother as the lead tough threatened, "Hey, fool, nice jacket. We collect an effort charity. Your charity and our collecting. Now hand it over." The one to his left grabbed for his collar. Bryce slapped his right hand over the tough's fist on his jacket and slammed his left hand out in a strong knife hand that thumped solidly into the side of the kid's neck, causing his carotid artery to constrict, cutting blood flow to his brain. The blow dropped the overly aggressive tough instantly into unconsciousness. He tossed the limp and collapsing fellow into the lead tough, tangling them both as the unconscious dragged the center man down. He followed through into the guy on his right with a left uppercut that knocked him cold too. The lead tough untangled and started to crawl over the top of his first fallen buddy. Bryce stepped around him to the left. The sidestep put Bryce in the perfect position for when the tough looked up. He drove his right foot into the side of the kid's jaw, knocking him senseless to fall over the buddy he just crawled out from under. Looking down at the 3 breathing but groaning and senseless punks, Bryce shook his head in disgust. Bryce stepped off casually down the corridor and deeper into the cheap commercial strip that abutted the tram stop. It was late, to the point of technically being morning, so there were not many people out and fewer shops open. After his show at the tram stop, the toughs avoided him, which saved the workout. Bryce wandered up and up through the levels until he walked to the door to Mario's office, finally arriving around 04:30 in the morning. Bryce made sure that several minutes went by with no traffic at the office that read as closed on the sign with no lights from within. Using only his hands, Bryce pried the door open, leaving the tape in place so the alarm would not trigger on the broken circuit. He slipped casually inside and levered the door shut again. Bryce changed his overshirt between the 2 he was wearing, so the reversal had his black and subtle gold showing. He watched the time tick down on the office wall unit, and he was still in Mario's office when the detective arrived at 0912. The automatic door shut behind him after the rotund man entered his office. Mario didn't see Bryce as he bustled into his own office. Bryce just sat quietly in the chair at the corner of the small, cramped office. Mario dropped his bag by the side of the desk as he passed. Mario shuffled around behind the desk to pour himself a cup from his automatic coffee pot plugged in along the back wall. The whole time he was showing Bryce his back. He still didn't notice Bryce until he was about to turn around to sit. Bryce began without any preamble, "Mr. Mario Temposo." Mario jumped out of his skin at the words coming from behind him in what should have been an empty office. He jumped around to face Bryce with his left hand clutching his heart. His clumsy and stumbling landing spilled some of his coffee on his front and the floor. Mario exclaimed a surprised curse and leaned forward to pull his scalding hot coffee-stained shirt away from his bulging gut. He exclaimed, "How in hell did you get in here, and who in the blazes are you?" Standing, Bryce fluffed his jacket out to the side, exposing his shoulder holster and the uniform under his jacket. "The High Commander sends his regards and requests your assistance." Pissed off and confused at the obstinate statement issued by a man with a gun in his office, Mario exclaimed, "The High Commander? Who in the hell is?" Cutting the other man off, Bryce continued, "High Commander Samson Rockpoint requires quiet access to your records regarding a mission he performed for you while under your employ." Apologizing profusely when he made the connection, Mario's eyes bulged when he realized who he had represented in his office. He could not do much as he pulled and fanned the still hot wet coffee stain on the front of his shirt. He spoke cautiously, I'm sorry, young man. I mean guardsman. Struggling for a polite way of saying it, Mario stuttered for a moment before continuing. I knew him under a different name and didn't immediately make the connection. Bryce nodded and accepted the apology, and suitably lied to protect the honor of his commander and a brother guardsman while polishing the mystique of his fraternity. The High Commander is aware of that detail. The disgraceful moniker John Smith and the outlaw status it accompanied served its purpose and diverted our enemy's attention from him. It allowed him to maneuver freely against them, and that false name has suitably been discarded by CEO Kroinos. His full name and title are now, and has been, High Commander Samson Rockpoint. He knew that 90% truth, 10% lie would hit the rumor mills eventually and reinforce the earned reputation for guardsmen brothers going to any lengths to protect their charges and destroy their enemies. Besides, he thought cynically to himself, everyone loved a good conspiracy story to share. Confused at the formality, Mario mumbled, I see. Bryce dictated, Nonetheless, the High Commander requires your assistance with a delicate and potentially dangerous matter that requires your discretion. It also requires the absence of electronic signatures between parties. Genuinely interested now, Mario stated, I'm listening. The guardsman briefed, A man has been brought to our attention at the hegemony level. He happens to be the same individual upon whom the High Commander performed a surveillance mission for you. Now Mario's interests were piquing because suddenly he was tied into potentially high-paying work and with powerful people who could end up owing him favors later. I see. Please continue, guardsman. Bryce dictated the crux of his orders. Put simply, Lady Persephone and the High Commander require duplicates of the report and a hook of some kind with which they can pull the interested party that placed the contract with you. After a long pause, Mario wondered, I see. So, you are asking me to screw my clients? Bryce fell into a formal parade rest and stared down at the shorter man across the desk. Mr. Temposo, the target of your investigation was beaten over every inch of his body from toes to groin to scalp. All his extremities were bloodied and bruised in the beating. His distinguishing tattoos and facial features were cut from or mutilated on his face, hands, feet, and between his legs. The target of your investigation apparently lasted a long time under his murder's attention. Post-mortem, they used 25-centimeter railroad spikes to nail him to a wall, and the coup de grace was that they injected sulfuric acid into your target's brain so they could obstruct our neural mapping procedures. Your clients are the last known connection of any form that registered law enforcement had with the murder victim. Mario paled. I see. That is horrible. Bryce agreed. Yes, it is. The only known link we have to this fellow is whoever had enough interest in him to hire a licensed third-party investigator to tag his vehicle with a tracking device so they could map his location. Considering the connection, do you see the lady's interest in your clients? The private detective agreed. I do. Cautioning, Bryce warned, Good, because I assure you that neither she, as Director of Hegemony Intelligence, nor the High Commander believe in coincidences. Mario sighed. All right. You know this is a violation of my professional ethics. Bryce arched an eyebrow at the veiled threat and obvious lie. He heard about Temposo's professional ethics from the High Commander in cuttingly humorous conversations while they were on the run, and that statement about Temposo's ethics left much to be desired. Bryce demanded, What do you want? He watched Mario through pinched eyes with images of the labor practice abuses and horrendous working conditions that the High Commander had endured under this man's direction. Labor abuse and violation of wage statutes were grounds for Business Bureau and Investigators Guild complaints. It was a metered and scaled complaint system with the independent business rating agencies, but if the complaint was filed by reputable sources or repeatedly, no one would do business with that agency again. A complaint from Persephone or the High Commander would be a death sentence to a small business like this one, because the rating agency would instantly place their credibility above that of all other sources. It would become more of a planetary headline than a bullet point on a small business complaint sheet. The news was news, and fair or not, some people's opinions just carried more weight in the hegemony than other voices. The rating agencies would pretend to be impartial with the review, but because of who posted that review, the sudden newsworthy importance of the review to the rating agency would far outweigh the value of the underlying business. Bad things would happen then in the form of news journals picking up the complaint as news, and suddenly it was planet-wide common knowledge. No small business could mount a public relations campaign large enough to fend off all that accumulated bad press. Even with the possibility of a lawsuit for slander, if it wasn't true, the damage would be done, and the suit would be difficult to win, to say the least. The reverse was also true. A positive review could catapult an unknown business into fame and notoriety based on the value of the celebrity endorsement. During Persephone and the High Commander's flight and random touring of the planet's sites, while followed by that reporter of theirs, they had discovered that slaving ring run by that reprehensible prick, CEO Lowe. That guy was never going to work for anyone again, let alone manage a company as CEO. He was lucky that he was not on a prison ship bound for trial on Earth. Had he not been as diligent and useful to CEO Kroinos, he very well would have been on one of those ships with many of his underlings who had direct knowledge and participation in those dealings. The fire sale disaster that had gutted that corporation as tens of thousands of falsely accused indentured service personnel were first repatriated between planets at the cost to Lowe's corporation and then compensated for their labor at the hegemony's wage agreements was a ruinous expense that left even infinitesimal shareholders gasping from the loss and legal exposure. All the dividends and share values owned became fair recompense for those repatriated. Anyone involved in CEO Lowe's company not willingly repaying the loss needed only be reminded about the Earth-based statutes governing the sale for profit of other sentient beings before they were scrambling for their checkbooks and carefully filing those payments in full receipts. Tumposo's ethics were just above CEO Lowe's. The only difference was that Tumposo didn't have much in the way of resources, and he was not trading in human flesh as profitable livestock. He was simply a greedy bastard who was profiting from hiring an untouchable and shunned criminal for below-wage standards to make a quick credit on the side. Mario dithered for another moment, interlacing and rolling his chunky hands over his girth before blurting, "Dinner." Confused, Bryce asked, "Dinner what?" Mario swiped a hand over his now sweating forehead and jowls as he exclaimed, "Dinner with Lady Persephone and the High Commander. My wife is a huge fan of Lady Persephone and would be thrilled to have dinner with her." Bryce suddenly passed his left hand across his face and gripped his right shoulder in disbelief as he pressed his right hand fully to his face at the revelation of the reward, and a huge headache slammed into his brain. There is so much wrong with that request, I don't even know where to begin. Hurt, Mario asked. "What's wrong with a dinner request? It's just a meal. It's not like we're bad people. We just struggle to get by like everyone else in this universe." Bryce held up his hands defensively. "Wahoo! Hold on there, Mr. Tumposo. First, I don't keep the lady's social calendar. I know firsthand better than to dictate terms to her on that type of thing. Second, Lady Persephone is head of Hegemony Intelligence. and the High Commander commands 2 divisions worth of personnel on this planet alone. Both are not exactly job positions that I can yank around or demand. I just don't have enough weight on my rank tabs to survive that type of demand on either of them. Third, we have no idea how dangerous this request may be, so anything we might work out would have to be after all our relevant interests in this case are disposed of. Dejected and crestfallen Mario crumbled as he sighed, "Oh." The spilled coffee stain was now cool enough that it didn't burn when he let go of his shirt. Bryce encouraged, "I'll see what I can do. Anything they send will probably fall out of the sky or be during some of the more absurd hours the 2 of them keep." More to himself, he mumbled before returning to the conversation, "Like everything else they're doing lately. It may take a little while to arrange, but I will see what I can do. Can that satisfy you for now?" Somewhat heartened, Mario said, "I suppose so." He turned on his desktop and started futzing with items on his desk, while the screen inlaid into the desktop started warming up. Mario gestured back to the chair where Bryce had been sitting and Bryce sat. He flicked items back and forth on the digital desktop that Bryce could not see from his acute angle, but the man was obviously working. Bryce asked, "What are you looking for?" Mario answered absently, "The file, it's in here somewhere. I just need to find the case file. I don't remember the name. I'll have to look by dates. Ah, here it is. Just give me 1 second." Bryce remained silent as the other man read, scrolling items along his desktop with his thumb. Mario spoke next. "This is interesting." Bryce asked, "What is interesting?" Shaking his head so his jowls wiggled, his brow furrowed, and lips pressed together, "It seems that the contracting agent never collected or even asked for his investigation deposit back. I'm required by guild law to keep the client's money in escrow, account for all expenses, deduct my portion, and return or retain for later client collection or later continued case use all unused funds. Ah, Mario nearly blushed. They paid for a 2-month-long investigation. Please don't tell anyone this, but well, I rolled a lot of other investigation overhead expenses and general office related expenses into that fund and still have a few thousand credits left over there." Bryce wondered, "What do you mean?" Mario began cautiously, High Commander Rockpoint finished what should have been a 2-month investigation in only a matter of 2 weeks. He spent 1 week in research and prep, another in the field, and he filed his report the night he finished his investigation. After that, he was hired out by his private client, who turned out to be Lady Persephone. She paid in gold coin money, so I didn't even look back or question her. She handed me a 10,000 credit coin. It's not like I get many of them come through here, ever. I lost a good investigator, but was relieved to have a pain in the ass gone and out of my hair, so I didn't even think much of it until I saw him on vid while eating dinner with my wife." Bryce shook his head in his own confusion and asked, "You said he was a pain in the ass. How in the eternal stars was he an—" Bryce corrected from the 3-letter word he was going to repeat, "difficult." Looking shocked at the stupid question, Mario nearly squeaked, "The bastard put a sword to my throat. I thought he was going to take my head clean off my shoulders. Instead, the crazy bastard stabbed a bug off the ceiling and sliced it in half in front of us all. Seriously? Who makes threats like that? And who the hell carries around a sword everywhere they go?" Grumbling and remembering his own experiences with the man, Bryce answered through clenched teeth, "The High Commander does. You know," dropping his formality a few notches, Bryce grumped, "I believe everything you just told me. He can be difficult to deal with." The detective scoffed, Difficult? That's the understatement of the century. Bryce actually scoffed. You never met her. Confused, Mario asked, How do you mean? Bryce laughed. Because she is the only person ever born who is more stubborn and pig-headed than he is. Those two are perfect together because somehow their types of stubbornness fit together perfectly. Pinching his fingers tight in front of his nose like staring down a long Gauss sights at Mario to make his point, he continued, Just right that they don't kill each other. Those two are probably the only two people in the whole universe who can tolerate the other on a personal level for longer than 15 minutes without making the other certifiably insane. Mario's gaping mouth slapped shut around his developing smile. So they're both. Difficult, then? Sweeping his hands out in a frustratedly dismissive gesture from the center of his chest out past his shoulders, Bryce grumbled past his own stifled chuckle. You have no idea. Smiling, Mario went back to reading. He flicked through a few more pages of the report with his thumb before looking up and shrugging dismissively. The easiest thing to do from my perspective is to just contact the listing party and ask them to collect the remainder of their escrowed retainer. It's just some shell corporation probably, but the contact address is still showing as active on my records. I'll offer to drop the credit voucher off to them in person so they can deposit it at the banking institution of their choice. Bryce shrugged at the simplicity of the plan. Okay, simple plans are the best plans, and that will give us a lead on who these people are. Mario shook his head. More or less. They could always refuse the money or turn out to be impossible to contact, in which case we don't get very far, but either way, it's a starting point. Nobody ever suspects the sweating fat guy is trying to play them. I'll just play the simpleton looking for the right people for a refund. I can ask more stupid questions that way. Bryce had to fight not to narrow his eyes as suspicion grew. The man in front of him was more craft than he let on. He was apparently running his slovenly persona for a reason. Bryce pulled a single silver 1,000-credit coin from his belt pocket and with one finger slid it across the desktop. The High Commander said that should cover your interest in opening this case. He says he's good for the costs, but if you try and run up the bill on him, he'll know. He also asked me to remind you that these could be very dangerous people you are sniffing after and to, in his words, not stick anything important anywhere where it could be snipped off. Mario cringed at the implication and grumbled. Interesting way of putting it. How will I contact you? I'm assuming you will be my point of contact. Bryce slipped a blank card with only an alphanumeric COM number message address on it. Send to that address. Send absolutely no results or details. Just tell me something like you are complete and I will find you. A little perplexed, but obviously understanding the security, Mario nodded and said, All right. Bryce left the office under the confused glances of the few investigators who had not left on their own missions for the day. They were collectively wondering where he was coming from and how he had gotten past them without the door chime alerting them and managed to get into the boss's office. Mario followed him out. When he got to the door, Bryce ripped the magnetic tape from the door's locking mechanism and said, This is the second time I've gotten into your office past these cheap locks. Get yourself a mechanical lock to go with it, or a better electromagnetic lock. And he walked out to begin his circuitous route back to the Citadel. Chapter 94. Casimir was having the time of his life, strolling down the corridors of a random tower in one of his underboss territories. He was nearly giddy as his hordes ripped and smashed valuables out of this particular shopping area. They were literally marauding by torchlight like some ancient earth pack of primitives. They were so far up in the tower that none of these deadbeats, low-lives, and miscreants swarming around them could have ever been admitted to this level, Even with a strong scrubbing with a wire brush, disinfectant, a day pass, and a homely grandmother in escort. One scum howled as he ripped into a jeweler's shop after he and his horde ripped open the mechanical security screen around the shop, literally tearing it out of the floor with nothing but persistence and pry bars. Look at air, a jewel dacizia testicle. His buddies roared in giddy laughter as they stuffed their pockets with pretties. Christos stood past them with his inner circle openly toting their assault Gauss and high-end night vision equipment. Christos laughed with them, but didn't want any technological interference, so he could savor all the sights and smells with his own senses. He used his own eyes, not night vision equipment. One thug shouted back, "Ya got yoursel a small testicle den. No wonder ya bitch likes me betta." The riot of giddy laughter and good spirits rippled through the looters as more displays were shattered and looted. The local boss, one of his captains, recognized him, even in the dark, and shouted, "Hail Christos!" His shout stopped his thugs in their tracks as they turned to him for the first time and shouted his name too. Casimir drank it in, smiling behind his mask, and pumped his fists to their cheers. With the power out all over the city in fits and starts thanks to their sequential detonation of relay stations and hubs, the world was plunged into chaotic darkness. The stations that they had destroyed sent surges of rippling redirected power into relays, repeatedly tripping many more of the overload and surge protections in sympathy with the multitude of stations they destroyed outright. He'd left specific instructions that they were to avoid looting the residential areas because that was where the corporate security forces would defend the most violently. It didn't take any brain power at all to explain to his thugs that the corporate forces would mass to protect their COs and their own families. He wanted people to hear and see the chaos, but not die from it, so they could tell everyone they knew about the fear and chaos they were witnessing. He wanted the fear to spread like wildfire, especially to the people up top, the ones with the money and the investments. Even behind their walls of security, they would hear the chaos he was unleashing. He'd also left the calm relay stations operable and deliberately left the buildings that housed the hegemony's securities exchanges untouched and with power. Any panicking investor with a powered handheld comm unit could turn it on, connect to their local comm relay station, and cash out their entire life savings in a panic. That would plunge the overnight markets into free fall. This would cascade into the various sectors of the exchanges, and then the power outage and subsequent rioting would be blamed on Kronos Generation holdings. That would add more panic and general instability to the planet's exchange markets. That would send their shares into free fall as the panic set in. The mass panic would drive more panic, and the shares would pancake in the morning when the markets formally opened and larger transactions could be accepted. The big money funds and institutions would open their doors that morning to cut their losses in a subsequent panic. Casimir knew those greedy bastards would cut losses and dump their shares as sure as the sun would rise. His calm pinged in his pocket, drawing his attention as he chuckled with his thugs. He was still having the time of his life. It had taken the better part of a month and a half to set this up from the meeting where he cajoled his captains into accepting the idea. The afternoon's closing market price for CGH had been just below 60 credits a share. The most recent notification he received through his comm had just told him that the share prices had dropped below 45. He boggled at the number. They had only been able to scrape together about 3.5 billion in coins, which bought them just over 1 billion shorts. They placed those shorts at 55 credits a share. Each option was worth 100 shares apiece. He reached out and yanked the collar of his captain, pulling him back into an over-the-shoulder embrace in his left arm as he held the comm between them and shouted with glee. Once he realized what he was looking at, the captain started shouting uncontrollably, and jumping like a half-witted child who'd received a gift. The more the price fell below 55, the more money they made. The $3.5 billion they'd invested was now worth about 8 times that after they covered their expenses, so they were looking at about 28 billion credits profit on the night. More than enough to celebrate and look like a fool over. Giddy from the heady victory, Casimir parted company and instructed them to continue to pillage until they were driven out by security forces or got too tired lugging around sacks of treasure. He broke away from the rioting and passed on the message to his other cohorts via a predetermined text code sent from his comm. He also signed with a moniker they had not discussed, but would grasp when they saw it, as he typed a simple win plus 28B, before he signed the message with his customary C. Even his dumbest underling could grasp that message. While he moved, he sold thousands of his in the money options remotely through his comm linked directly to the syndicate's account with Lennox and Stewart's brokerage firm. Using a nice little encrypted program that his number 4 had written for him, he was able to covertly bounce his orders around hundreds of shell accounts before executing the sales. The result was making the transaction nearly invisible through each account that required a different password before passing the order on to the next account. It would keep even the most powerful infiltration software busy for days and possibly weeks depending on other applications and requirements on those systems. Casimir intended to create so much chaos that those systems would indeed be overloaded. He also intended to be secure with his gains long before then. They strode purposefully down the powerless darkened corridor with only the light from Casimir's comm, as he routed their gains into enormous pots of credits stashed in dozens of accounts linked by that one clever little program. They had not just shattered the CGH traded interests on this world, because the entity that was traded there represented CGH's assets on hundreds of worlds. The perspective Casimir's goons had created here was that the universe was imploding. Since the holding company was traded here, that was all that mattered for him to seize the off-world assets by complicated proxy fight thereto. All he needed was 41%, and he could outvote his aunt and uncle, their wretched cheap whore daughter, that Telmy's fool, and his traitorous wife's block. If he could snatch that, he'd have a controlling interest and could kick them out of the Citadel legally. The overnight trading volume of available shares continued to rise, and the price kept falling lower and lower as new entrants to the selling frenzy struggled to underbid those already in panicked selling mode. Casimir giggled almost manically as he picked up tens and hundreds of thousands of shares with his gains every few minutes, effectively for free. He had not even begun to touch his personal reserves from his own short selling of the stock. He'd kept his credits separate from the rest of the syndicate's offering. Those fools had not even bothered to look at the math that their 5 shares were being split 6 ways to include Casimir, while he was already taking a boss share of 1 in 4 credits. It tickled him that he was taking the boss share already, while swindling them out of an extra 6 to slip into his personal pockets. It thrilled him to be getting away with that sleight of hand. He was tucked into their waiting air car, still playing with his comm and laughing in ecstasy as he watched his personal wealth climb back into the billions of credits range, never mind his control over the syndicate business portions, once he knocked off the current heads of his 5 subordinate organizations. He'd make sure that Gellerman, Morneau, Foster, and Meade became very wealthy men in their own rights, but they'd be nowhere near his stature. Their air car with Meade at the controls and Gellerman up front smoothly joined the pre-dawn traffic in the totally dark city grid they were flying through before they passed into the next grid, where they'd left the power available because there was a comm relay center or some other strategic piece of technology they wanted to keep active for the duration of their fun. As dawn approached and the markets started to open with early bird traders waking up to the alerts in their systems, more and more panic swept the markets. Casimir cackled and bounced like a madman, hooting and exclaiming, drawing glances from the other 4 men in their vehicle. When he noticed, he exclaimed, "The price dropped below 9 credits just now. I'm selling the rest of our in the money options. We've just made hundreds of billions of credits." The more the prices went down, the more money he made after all. They flew at a serene and stately pace, low and slow to not draw attention to themselves. With those profits and prices, Casimir easily scooped up nearly 1 billion shares before they left the block that they were flying past. It took nearly 2.5 hours for the markets to open and the large institutional investors to enter the market with that enormous buying and selling power. More shares flooded the market, and the price scraped its belly just over a single credit per share. Casimir hooted and stomped some more and bought more shares until his finger was tired and the sun was up. He went completely insane when he announced that they'd captured 200 billion shares as the opening bell saw the panicked institutions selling their holdings. He bought them all. He tried to keep the price down at 1 and 2 credits per share, but there just were not enough shares still being sold. Since they'd blown out the power transformers and specific regulation stations, not the heavily guarded reactors, all the commuter trams were down since they could not pass from the powered grid to the unpowered grid without stranding passengers. That trapped tens of billions of people in their night jobs, in their homes, and in towers set aflame and pillaged by his ravenous gangs. It would be as long as a week before they replaced enough of the damaged infrastructure to restore power to the entire city. Casimir didn't care. That was not his problem. Suddenly things turned about 50 minutes after the opening bell. Suddenly the price began to reverse and slowly, but inexorably climb a lot faster than his purchasing volume would indicate. His mood changed as the tide of selling turned to buying, and he started with a simple "no," followed by another and another that got louder and louder as the price climbed higher and higher up out of the single digits, and then back into the low double digits, and then slowly up into the teens over the next hour and a quarter as they slowly flew. Casimir shouted in frustration and hurled his comm so hard into the floor of their vehicle that it cracked and spilled its electronic guts, along with all the programming required to access their accounts until Foster could repair it. Gellerman asked, "Sir, what's wrong?" Casimir raged. The price turned. Our last orders choked off at 15 credits per share before they were filled at the single digits. Meade asked dumbly from the front seat like the idiot blunt instrument he was, "Isn't that a good thing? I mean, we want the price high when we own it, right?" Casimir snapped, "No, you dick-brained moron. We don't want the prices high. We can't buy more of the company when the prices are high. How in the hell can we seize control of the company when we piss away all our money on high-priced shares? You're a bloody idiot. I only have 14% of the company. I don't control shit with that." Instead of continuing his verbal tirade, Casimir slammed his white-knuckled hands into the back of the seat in front of him and kicked it furiously until his foot hurt and leg burned, then switched legs and did it until both legs burned from the strain. They rode in silence for a time as Foster toyed with the cracked comm he'd somehow snatched off the floor. Casimir ordered, "Take me to my container. I need to get this mask off before I start killing people." The protests about flying directly ended when he snapped with pure venom in his voice, "Now." They rode in silence for a little over an hour and a half as Meade piloted them unobtrusively farther and farther out from the center city towards Casimir's residential container. He pulled his clean and never-before-used throwaway comm out of his pocket and sent a short message to his emergency contact that included only an address and time. Once he saw the message was gone, he popped the memory card out of the device that contained the codes for the phone and snapped the thin wafer in two. Foster, sitting next to him, realized he had an alternate comm available, now with no memory. He plucked the device out of Casimir's hands, and instead of toying with the guts and case of the broken comm, he just pulled the card from the shattered comm and slotted it in the device. Foster powered it and handed it back with all the account windows glaring irritatingly in his eyes. Casimir's failure was evident with every green uptick of CGH indicating a recovery of the share price. He felt humiliated, betrayed, and furious. Casimir lowered the vehicle's window across Morneau and flicked half of the yanked memory chip out the window. 15 minutes later, he flicked the second half. It was not the most secure way to dispose of anything, but 15 minutes apart at a casual 120 to 150 kilometers per hour, flight speed meant those pieces were kilometers apart when they finally landed as just more fallen debris. He was numb from the experience. He didn't know if he wanted to hide and cry or just sit and stare straight ahead. He'd come so close to only seizing a little under 15% of the company. Casimir sighed heavily as the fatigue of staying awake all night and the prior day finally settled in around him with the emotional crash of failure. He knew at his core it was not his fault, though. He got screwed. Someone had deliberately screwed him and wrecked the plan. Someone undercut him in his purchases. That had to be it. He looked at Foster on his right. I want you to track every move those asshole low-lives make. I bet one of those pricks is the one who undercut us. They turned around and hamstrung us. They spent too much time nagging me for more information about the whys and hows. One of them must have played dumb and screwed me over. Track down the traitor. To the rest of them he ordered, in the meanwhile, I'll liquidate as much of our gains as I can into coins. Those idiot syndicate lowlives will be stuck with the shares, and since they'll be deemed as gained during an outlaw enterprise, they will eventually be seized in forfeiture, and they will be obviously worthless to any of us. They will be auctioned to the public after the forfeiture on the open market. Turning to Morneau, I'm going to have visitors in a little while. The challenge code is Rising Sun, and the entry code is Departing Moon. To the four of his subordinates, he repeated in his numb, disbelieving confusion, because of the traitor in our thugs and hired help, I'm going to cash out as much of this as I can in coin immediately. We all need to go deep to the ground. It will not take the vermin long to track us down and follow our transactions once they start looking for us. If we're caught with shares, they will be worthless. But we'll all be able to walk away with millions of credits worth of coins and live well for a very long time. I need to get off the world for a little while. We all have each other's emergency comm numbers memorized. We need to go deep for a little while and let this heat that's about to come blow over for a few years before we try again. I swear we need to track down and destroy whoever this traitor is. He sent orders to the Rutger brothers to produce his earnings in coins. They rode in silence the remaining hour plus it took to settle their vehicle into the open and neglected warehouse bay that was still empty of all life larger than rodents, and their highly sensitive sensors told them the same. The human scavengers didn't even bother picking over these wrecks anymore. They knew by rote that they were empty and of no interest after so many years of being picked clean. When they landed Jellerman, Foster and Meade remained with the vehicle and left shortly after touchdown. Morneau departed with Casimir, who started to strip almost before the vehicle left, handing the pieces and parts of his disguise to Morneau as he paced irritably in front of his container residence. Casimir snapped, "Burn them," referring to his disguise and his desire to sever the ties with the current betrayal. He was numb and wanted to be alone. "Mind the perimeter. I want some time to think." Casimir ignored the perfunctory, "Yes, sir." He sat and stared at the walls of his container for almost 2 hours before his calm chirped irritatingly next to him. He checked, and it was those sanctimonious prick brothers-in-law. He forwarded the message automatically to Jellerman. He told those two idiot brothers to have his coin ready immediately. He wanted it divided evenly among 10 containers, one each for Morneau, Foster, and Meade, though he seriously considered cutting Meade out for his stupidity in their ride over, 2 shares for Jellerman as his primary, and 5 for himself because it was his. He was going to end up with a paltry 150 million credits and a little extra, but that was close to 950 pounds of gold coin. Casimir pressed his face into his hands as he scraped along his emotional bottom. The world had truly turned against him. He wondered idly why they used such an archaic weight measurement system for their gold coin. It was just stupid. Ounces and pounds made no sense. Using 16s instead of easy-to-manage 10s in metric was so asinine. He heard people approaching and pulled his pistol out from under his pillow while standing to face the open doors with his hands braced casually behind his back to conceal the drawn pistol. He waited. 2 nondescript fellows accompanied Morneau. "Sir, these gentlemen accepted and passed your challenge and password sequence. Is there anything you need from me, or do you need to be undisturbed?" Casimir decided to keep his security procedures in place in front of the foreign intelligence operatives he was dealing with for the moment. He began, "No, number 3. These gentlemen and I are going to discuss my exfiltration from this planet, and I need you to stand by for the delivery of our property." Morneau nodded. "Understood, sir." Morneau turned and retreated out of hearing distance. Casimir slipped the weapon into his back waistband and invited them into his space-worthy travel container. He had everything he needed for up to 6 months in space, encased in this high-tech 12 by 2.5 by 2.5 meter rectangle. He had a self-contained power, atmosphere, food, water, recycling for all of them, gravity, workout materials, sleeping, personal hygiene, and storage space, plus vids, reading, and entertainment material to last 50 lifetimes. The container had external vid pickups on all sides, so he could watch outside with passive sensors if the view was unobstructed. The container even had emergency survival, stasis, and rudimentary medical care packed into its shell. Every service built into the container was also zero-gravity capable and adaptive. And all of that was shielded so that to cursory scans it looked no different than any other cargo container ever built. They detailed the departure method and even had a novel approach to circumventing port security since the power was out and systems were disrupted. They'd simply have one of their agents at the port slip his container into the manifest as already cleared so long as he arrived before the power grid came fully back online. That eventuality didn't look like it was going to happen any time in the next 24 hours for the port. His thugs had deliberately hit that location hard, partially out of his frustration, but mostly because it destroyed a series of infrastructure junctions that would make restoring power there a nightmare. It had apparently been the right choice given the asset these two had in place. All Casimir had to do was be in his container and ready for shipment during the next 4 to 8 hours. He would be at the port in 3.5 hours after that. He would sit there for some time and lift once power was restored. He would spend the next 3 months ferrying around various deep space switching relays. Deep space switching relays were nefarious black market exchanges that rotated and moved through the interstellar black to avoid planetary customs and fees. They were dead drops for multi-ton containers that constantly moved to stay one step ahead of and avoid detection by corporate security forces. And then he would arrive at his destination. It was a small price to pay to get off this inhospitable rock he was stuck on right now, so Casimir agreed. He dismissed them and returned to his container. He was reading when his inner circle returned with a heavily laden airvan. They swiftly unloaded his 5 containers as Casimir thoroughly inspected each one that he accepted and packed them into the storage shelves of his container, each securing crate weighed over 75 kilograms each, and they didn't move easily. He shook their hands and instructed them to find and exterminate the traitor who disrupted their plans, then to take their shares, go into deep cover, and await his return. With them gone, he shut his doors and turned on his monitors, watching the 5 cleared sides of his container while reading a novel he'd wanted to read for quite some time. He did anything he could to take his mind off the murderous rage that only strangling the traitor with his bare hands could sate. At the 7-hour mark, an airship arrived, deftly maneuvered through the gaping warehouse doors, scanned his container's markers, zeroed in, clamped him, and lifted him up and out of the warehouse with a practiced skill that even he could appreciate, especially since he was inside. He watched through the 6 vid cameras in all the different angles as he was carted through the city he'd known all his life and was now leaving for an unknown time. He checked to see that the system was automatically recording the flight. It was doing as it was supposed to, so he went back to his reading and relaxed. He clamped down on his rage and focused his mind. He would watch the exit flight over and over during his trip. He was on his way now. He had his 150 million credits, but that did little to balm the wound of betrayal and failure that he'd suffered. This morning he should have seized control. By the time he had finished exterminating the underlings, he would have had complete control of their underworld empire plus the legitimate face of the hegemony's executor corporation. Casimir pushed that abject rage aside and forced a calming breath. He would be back to reclaim what was his. Of that he was sure.
Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate your listening. When you get a chance, please come and hit the like, subscribe, leave a comment, and check out the book for real down in the description.